Same here.
Yeah, we've been planning this conversation for a while, a couple weeks now. Truly, right? Like we're recording this during Pride Month 2025, so happy Pride. And also kind of grounding. We know Pride initially started as a protest, and I think for some of us, it's time to dust off those activist and advocacy skills, really to protect the gains that we've seen over these past couple of decades, and also still dreaming towards what we still need to do. So much of our work is still trying to build a world where we all get what we need so we can live happy and healthy lives. So super grateful for you all. You both have had remarkable careers leading to significant roles within the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And so I just wanted to start for those folks who might be unfamiliar with who you both are. I think, in my opinion, you will be in history books. So we get to connect with some living legends right now. So I'm hoping that you could maybe take a minute or two just to share on maybe a key moment or experience in your journey up to the EEOC that's really shaped your commitment to workplace equity, particularly for LGBTQ plus inclusion. And Hai, we'll go first with you, and then Karen will then pivot to you.
Great. And I'm so glad we're doing something like this in this moment in time when so many people do feel so threatened and so hurt. And so getting some sense of optimism and hope is to me essential, right? And I mean, I came out in 1979 when I was 20 years old, just graduated from college. In fact, I participated in the very first March on Washington in 1979. Very willing to continue to have those protest signs. And so I've been working in the movement for a bit over 40 years. But thinking about your question about particular experiences, so there are probably two early experiences that stand out for me. I worked as a lawyer at the ACLU Lesbian Gay Rights Project and HIV Project shortly after I had been clerking for Justice Blackmun. And that was from about 1988 to 1991. And I was at the right place, the right time to essentially help lead the drafting of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, that provided employment protection for people with AIDS and HIV, as well as people with other disabilities. So I think that really gave me a frontline understanding of the importance of having the full range of the civil rights community working together to advance equity, even in that case, for one group, people with disabilities. That's because people with disabilities had been working with those civil rights groups on other issues. That coalition is key. And then that actually led into a second formative experience, which started in 1992 and then extended for many, many years when I helped lead the drafting of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, which was a bill that started with prohibiting discrimination in employment based just on sexual orientation. And again, after a number of years, coalition building, learning, counting myself as learning, I then sort of led the effort to include gender identity in that bill. Basically, I learned a lot about coalition work and the importance of listening to people with respect, because that enables you to negotiate effectively.
Yes. Yes. That's such a powerful kind of overview of so much amazing advocacy that you've done, High. In the I think I first learned the term legislative lawyering from you, and I was hoping like maybe you could
Yes.
share just a little bit of that because I think that's also a really key part of your history in the movement.
Oh my God. I'm just, people can't see because it's a podcast. They can't see the huge smile on my face.
Yes.
Um, So during the ADA, I was a legislative lawyer. That is, I loved law and I understood the law, but I also loved politics. So I was involved in the legislation so I could understand why the lawyers wanted certain words in the ADA, but why politically we couldn't get those words, but we could get other words that served the same goal.
Yeah.
And so then I went to Georgetown Law School, taught there for 18 years, and I started a legislation clinic where I taught the law students legislative lawyering and really understanding the importance of text
Mhm.
in the words in a statute, but the importance of politics and
Yeah.
how to bring that together. And that term wasn't in place,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it is now, and I just love it.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And just talking about the importance of coalition, that kind of intersectional coalition, like really kind of putting that into practice and how we learn from each other as we kind of push towards movements towards justice in all of its forms. And so, Karen, like I know that you also a Titan in this space, and so I was hoping you could share just a little bit about what led up to you kind of getting involved with the EEOC.
Well, first of all, I'd love to go get in a time machine and take that class.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
But I always had an interest in civil rights, and that mainly because my parents both came here from Puerto Rico, and they instilled in me the idea that we truly all are equal, and I saw them live that out. My father had a pharmacy in Brooklyn, and we would work in the pharmacy, me and my siblings, and he treated everyone with respect. I remember too when the HIV medications first came out, and he had some of the first folks who were using those medications and that cocktail, and he was also one of the few pharmacists that would in that time in that area that had those clients, and I saw how he treated them, and there was just a natural humanity about the way my parents raised me. But a key moment that stands out for me was like hi goes back a little bit in law school. Um, where I was participating in like a student showcase, like a variety show, right, where we would make fun of the professors and the like. And I was in a skit where I actually did a very bad parody of a queer person. And when I was in rehearsals, I had second thoughts. It just didn't feel right, but I went ahead and did it anyway. And I ended up hurting a lot of feelings and one person's feelings in particular. And I took a moment and, I think if it were nowadays, I would have been canceled. I've kind of thank goodness that there was no social media back then. But, I took a step back and I was called out by some of my fellow students. And instead of instead of saying anything, I just took it all in what they had to say and why what I did was wrong and hurtful, and sat with it, and then apologized specifically to the person whose feelings I deeply hurt, and that person forgave me and gave me grace, and it is just this was almost 30 years ago, and that has stayed with me forever. In fact, a few years ago, I tracked down this person's email. I won't name them because they deserve their privacy, and just reiterated. I said, I don't know if you remember, but that moment of grace and forgiveness you gave me have shaped my career. And we had a little bit of a lovely back and forth. And I just thought, people can change, people can evolve. We all should be humble. So I've tried to carry that throughout my career and always be um, teachable, and have go forward with the understanding that other people's presences should not just be tolerated, but they should be celebrated. And so that was a key shift that in my life that has been sort of embedded in every role I've had leading up to this last role as an EEOC judge.
That's huge. And thank you for being vulnerable, Karen, to share that story of learning. Those moments where we cause harm, right? Like as humans, we're wired to cause harm. For the relationship that you had with this one person who was harmed, right? For them to be brave enough to share with you and for you to take that in a way of not being defensive in the moment, but allowing that to kind of like be processed in your body and to really kind of extend in an act of forgiveness. Like this is kind of like a master class, right? For the work that so many who listen to this podcast, like what do we do in those moments? Like are people capable of change? And I think the more that we share these stories of like the big fumbles where we have caused harm to another person or a group, that's almost like an invitation for people that might still be on that learning journey of kind of being more accountable for behavior that is harmful, to know that it's possible to recover and to receive that act of forgiveness. So thank you. I just wanted to kind of lift that up, and how significant that moment was and instructive to really be in alignment with kind of how your dad kind of operated, just with like inclusion being in his blood, of working at the pharmacy that he did. So really powerful stories. So thank you both for just sharing that.
It's the first time I've told that one
Yeah, yeah, that's a big share.
publicly. So
Thank you.
I hope it's received in
Yes,
that way.
with
Oh,
care.
oh my God, just speaking as me, as Chai, that speaks volumes to me because especially in this moment in time
Mhm.
when so many people are hurting us, to try to figure out where are the places where we can give grace
Yes.
so that we can help move some people so they understand what we are experiencing. I think that's huge. So, Karen, thank you for making this your first time when I get to hear it.
Yes.
Seeing
Yes.
you.
Yeah,
Thank
there's
you for making a safe space to share that, Rhodes and Kai.
yeah, absolutely. And it's you both may have heard this kind of phrase of catching rather than canceling, right? And I think in this moment, right, as more people might be learning some things, right, and might be feeling betrayed by what's happening, in the United States and maybe beyond, is really catching and like bringing people in to share what we know, right? And to also listen and to learn, right? So I think that's an act of peace, and we really need more of that these days. So, so let's kind of look back. So this is still, we're in looking back mode. And I want to recognize, like, definitely over the past 2 decades, I think one of the biggest success stories in workplace inclusion work is the inclusion of LGBTQ plus employees. And so, I'm curious, like leading up to this year, what do you both consider maybe as the most significant advancements or wins for LGBTQ plus workplace inclusion and protections? And maybe there's like a policy or a landmark decision that, in your opinion, really moved the needle. So, Haya, I want to go to you first, and then Karen will go to you.
Yeah, so yes, I think we have some landmark legal decisions, but I just want to put that in the context of overall progress and change because, at least through my 40 years of working, it has always seemed clear to me that we need at least three variables happening. We need law, and that can be a statute, it can be cases. We need policies and practice, right? That just not words in a law, but how is it really being implemented? And we need social norms. We need the majority of people to believe that whatever the right is that is being embodied in that law and those policies is something they believe in.
Yes.
Okay, so law, policies, and practice, and social norms. And I think by the fact that lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, and more recently transgender folks have been able to come out and share their stories, that has helped shift social norms. And by the way, those three variables are not like linear. They're not sequential. They're interactive. They're dialectical. They affect each other, right? So that has been essential. Some of the social norm change for what I'll now, in terms of answering a question on the law piece, what have been some landmarks? Well, when we started drafting ENDA, we drafted it because even though we had Title VII that says you shouldn't have sex discrimination, no one saw discrimination against gay people or transgender people as sex discrimination. Now, ironically, think about the EEOC. In 1972, a trans person brought a claim to the EEOC saying she had been discriminated against after she transitioned. And the EEOC was like, no.
Mm.
but that was because of some medical operation you had, right? And they also said Congress clearly didn't intend to cover you. And then they said the same thing about gay people a few years later in a charge. And the courts just followed that. Okay, so there was no protection in the courts, which is why we felt we needed ENDA.
Yeah.
Well, that shifted. And when I came onto the EOC in 2010, I discovered for the first time what Karen will be able to describe to you that EOC was not issuing opinions and charges anymore, but we were issuing opinions with regard to federal employees.
Mm. Mhm.
Now, in the conceptual legal world, including the one I was in, so I wrote a law review article about this, it's like, give me a break. If you discriminate against someone because they are attracted to someone of the same sex as opposed to the opposite sex, duh, that is sex discrimination, right? I mean, if you discriminate against someone because they transitioned from one gender to another, or as trans folks like to say, they aligned as opposed to transition, they aligned their gender with what they had always been. Obviously, that's sex discrimination. So when I was at the EOC, there was this vehicle of opinions being issued in cases brought by federal employees. And so a huge shift in 2012 was when the EEOC issued a decision called Macy, which is where we said discrimination based on gender identity is a form of sex discrimination. And here's why. And then 3 years later, in 2015, we issued a case called Baldwin, saying discrimination based on sexual orientation is sex discrimination, and just laid out the theory. And that began to change the legal landscape. I still remember the very first district court that cited one of those cases. I cut it out, I put it up on my whiteboard, right? From district courts, it went to circuit courts of appeal. Courts were actually reversing their own precedent, saying, oh, yeah, of course it is. And I used to say at the time, society had to change before legal logic could catch up.
Yes.
And that's the importance of coming out. And ultimately, that led 5 years ago, 2020, to the Supreme Court in Bostock saying, look at that. Discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity, it only happens because of sex. So you are all covered right now under federal sex discrimination law, Title VII. And that's regardless of what state you live in this country. No matter how quote unquote red the state is, you are covered under federal law. And I'll say one last thing. Towards the end of June, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that was so harmful and painful to transgender people. It's called discriminate. It basically allowed a state to deny essential health care to, in that case, transgender minors. But embedded in that decision, the court doubled down on, reaffirmed the Bostock decision to say that employment protection, that is still standing for you. They didn't have to do that,
Wow.
and they did.
Wow.
So always when there are setbacks, we also have to keep our eyes on where some of our progress has been retained.
Yes. Thank you for sharing that, because I think I was just so focused on the big decision that I completely missed that. So I think that's a really important item to flag, especially for the audience who's listening today. So hi, thank you for sharing that. I have goosebumps just kind of going through some of that history. So thank you for that. And Karen, I wanted to turn it over to you as well, just kind of some of those historic gains and what you've seen in your own role at the EEOC.
Well, Bostock for me I was so excited when that decision came down. And that's how I feel about most decisions that I do a happy dance for. It's really just the law catching up with what's really happening or what really needs to happen socially. And what I think so the historic gains for me happen more on the street, and I see it in myself, the shifts in my own mind, the opening up of my own sense of possibility. And it's all working towards all of us just being free. So that's how, I kind of feel the grumblings of gains. And I think storytelling like you do here on the podcast is so important. And we don't need a law or legislation to have permission to tell our stories. So, um, I love hearing people's stories. And that was something that as a judge, I got to do every day. And it didn't necessarily lead to, any landmark decisions. Yes, I have written decisions that I'm very proud of, but federal sector, everything's anonymized. So someone citing it wouldn't necessarily know it was one of my decisions. But hearing the stories of the federal employees that would come before me, some of who have been trans, are fantastic. They really give the nuance um, that you need to understand, the how harmful or helpful a policy or a law or a mindset can be. So to me, that's, where I see the historic gains is, how free are people to tell their stories. So right now, we're in a very fraught time, but I do see more and more people, especially trans and non-binary people, sharing their stories. They don't need permission from the Supreme Court. So to me, that's a gain.
I love that. I just kind of thinking, Hi, what you were sharing of kind of like law, policy, and you were talking about like norming. I just think of like the role of culture and like that to your point, Karen, like the power of storytelling. And I was sharing with you both like before kind of doing what I do today. I worked at PFLAG National as a policy director. And so yeah, we were kind of like in the weeds on law and policy, right? And kind of working in coalition. But I feel like what we were able to add is kind of like bringing in this network of parents, families, friends, like allies kind of showing up not out of self-interest but out of love for people in their life, and to really add to some of like the kind of more wonky work that we were doing. But I feel like those stories were often like the catalyst to get a legislator to be like, oh wait, we grew up in the same town and we went to the same school and the same church, and you have a gay son. Oh, okay. Like it just, you could see a shift, and it was so powerful. I was just kind of like jealous of that power of like, wait, you just need to tell that one story and we were able to get that legislator. So I'm curious from your perspective, Karen, like was there like a story that stood out for you where it was like a light bulb of like, oh, I get it now? Or I just, because I feel like those stories too, if none come to mind, that's okay. But I just, I feel like that might be helpful for other people too, just to make those kind of really powerful connections of like, oh, this is my neighbor or someone in my family. And I don't know if there's a story that comes to mind, but
Yeah, the cases that I worked on, they're all covered by the Privacy Act, so I can't talk about specifics.
yes, okay,
But I
yes,
will say that when I came out of the gate objecting to what the EEOC started to do at the beginning of this administration, which was attack trans people, um, and I spoke out, the folks that were most supportive within the agency were trans and queer colleagues, right? They reached out to me, called me, emailed me, um, and I didn't even know that some of them were trans. And so just by speaking up for someone I didn't necessarily know personally allowed me entry into actually new relationships, new
mm,
friendships.
yeah,
Um,
oh yeah,
and
yeah,
it's been I have like a whole new posse now. It's incredible
yeah,
of people that I learned from.
yeah.
So that those are that story I think to me for me is the most significant that I said yes you deserve you deserve the respect. You
Mm.
deserve not to be attacked by this administration. You deserve to show up at work as your authentic self and just and do your job and be accepted and again celebrated, not tolerated. And just by saying that, it's like I had like a dozen instant friends.
Absolutely.
And then there's stories to, things to learn about them. And then I could share things about me. And it was just so very visceral and human. And
Yeah.
that's been the best part of this really strange time we're in.
Mhm. Yeah, I think you speak to like that power of risk taking, right? Of like taking a risk of, okay, I'm going to show up for these folks who are trans and non-binary, and by taking that risk, some folks on your own team are coming forward of like, wow, that's so great. Let me tell you about being trans. That purposeful disclosure. Like you're each kind of taking moves towards each other, and it just kind of demonstrates like what we mean by moving at the speed of trust with our relationships is like sharing something that matters that feels like big and another person receiving that with care. So thank you for providing that example.
Which is what you did at the top by, giving me a safe space to share that initial anecdote. So
Yeah, we're doing it. We're modeling
yeah,
human
you
trust.
see?
Cool. Thank you. Thank you. I'm just gonna play this the next time I have to do like a workshop training. Here we go. Um, okay, so thank you for taking us down memory lane. So here we are today, 2025, and lots of shifts in our world, and certainly within the federal government. You all know this better than me. And so I was hoping that, just kind of given those shifts, particularly regarding the EEOC's enforcement of what they're supposed to be doing, right? What are some of the most pressing threats that you see to LGBTQ plus workplace protections? So we'll start there, and then maybe some actions we can talk about in just a bit. But Karen, as an administrative law judge, I was hoping you could speak to some of that, and then Hai, we'll go over to you.
I think my answer may surprise you, but you know, while I do think what the agency's acting chair is doing is extremely harmful and what the Trump administration is doing is extremely harmful, I think it's the silence of colleagues that is, to me, the most immediate danger or threat. Um, I felt really unsafe myself in the workplace when there was absolute silence around the executive orders that on their face are illegal. And not only that, they come right out and attack trans people. So I looked around and I thought somebody's going to say something, at least acknowledge that this is unprecedented and offer some kind of space to say, I know this is difficult. We're going to get through this together. Be a team leader. And there was nothing, absolutely nothing. And I found that to be, and then the continuation of it, the putting their heads down. And I'm talking about people in leadership positions, putting their heads down and kind of just either hoping they could, wait out the next 4 years or somebody else would say something, but really abdicating their responsibility as leaders. That's so damaging. I've managed attorneys. At one point, I was managing about 40 attorneys in a different position, and I always felt like I was the go-between or the protector between them and my supervisor at the time, and they could come to me with anything, and they had a space, or if something was going on that affected them, I might not be able to change it right away or address it right away, but at least acknowledge it exists. So I thought that was really, really harmful, not just to trans employees, but to everyone. It's like if you're not going to acknowledge that this is a, an earth-shattering executive order for many of your colleagues and neighbors and friends, then it sends the message like, I don't really care about you, or your existence doesn't matter enough for me to acknowledge this is problematic. So to me, that was the worst part of it and the most heartbreaking part of it. And that's the heartbreak I initially needed to get past in order to um, keep advocating and keep speaking up.
Yeah, yeah. And on that point of that silence, right? That's you're just demonstrating the bystander effect, right? Where it's like bad things are happening, surely someone will say something, and like you said, kind of abdicating like leaders at the highest levels of just staying silent and looking around. And I have some follow-up questions for you because you've taken some really big acts of bravery. So we'll get to that in just a bit. Hi, I wanted to go over to you on this question too, of just like what you are seeing in terms of shifts with the EEOC.
Yeah, boy, Karen, I want to underscore what you said because I really think one of the huge pieces of harm happening in this country right now, writ large, is the fact that people are afraid and they self-censor, and that's horrible. I'm hoping that we're going to start seeing a shift, seeing the importance of resistance and speaking up. And so the need to speak up, you need to know what's going on. I started posting on LinkedIn in a way that I wasn't. Anyone who's listening to this, feel free to
Yes,
connect with me on LinkedIn. I post a
fire.
lot on
Your
that.
comments are fire. So definitely,
You
yes.
will, and I just early on started writing, stay informed, stay angry, stay engaged. And then I said I probably don't need to help anyone stay angry, but to really know how to respond, you have to stay informed, right? So just looking at the EEOC, what Acting Chair Andrea Lucas has done over the last number of months has been truly horrific because she has done things without any legal authority. She has done things contrary to the law. She was asked at her confirmation hearing on June 18th, well, if you got an illegal directive from the president, would you follow that or would you follow the law? And she spent most of her answers saying, well, of course, I would never get anything illegal from the president, and blah, blah. And then her very last sentence sort of mumbled, and I would follow the law. Well, that's interesting because she hasn't been. And so, on a range of issues, and what I would say to the audience listening is one of the groups that I helped organize, like within 3 weeks, 4 weeks of the administration coming on, was a group that we call the EEO Leaders. So it's eeoleaders.org. You can go on the website. And what we have done is anytime Andrea Lucas has done something, or there's been an executive order that we know Lucas will then be implementing, we have a group of two former EEOC chairs, four former EEOC commissioners, two general counsels, former general counsels, two former legal counsels. I mean, we put together the heavy hitters, and I bought the domain name, eeoleaders.org. And we put out, whether it was letters, statements, explanatory documents, many of them geared for the people I hope are listening today, folks doing DEI, folks doing culture change, general counsels, to say, don't just look at what she's saying. Here, we're going to tell you what the law actually is. And a letter that we just put out yesterday called an open letter to Andrea Lucas. Again, people in the podcast
You
can't
can't see me, but I'm
Yes.
fist pumping because the letter was so good.
Yeah, all of these links
see.
we'll include in the show notes too. Yes.
Excellent. And basically it said, number one, oh, thank you for sharing that you will follow the law. Um, and could you please clarify what you understand is the law under Bostock? Because in the confirmation hearing, she said, yes, and Bostock says you can't fire someone because they're trans or gay. And it's like, it'd be good to read the decision because that's not what it said. But just go ahead and read an opinion, Skermetti, that came down from the Supreme Court. It came down while you were testifying, so understandably, you didn't have the chance to read it then. But why don't you read it now and make it clear that you agree with what the Supreme Court said? It doubled down on Bostock and said Title VII in all of its employment actions cover trans people, gay people. So it's about monitoring what's going on and creating a structure to respond. So you can respond as an individual with the telling stories that is so important to keeping people informed and angry and engaged. and seeing if there's some organized structure that you can connect with. That's what we need to be doing.
I love it. Yeah, because that was my follow-up question, was kind of actionable, things that we can be doing to just kind of counter some of these threats at the EEOC. And I remember, seeing a post on LinkedIn. I'm following you a lot, just on that EEO leaders, and I think it's brilliant. And I'm kind of curious, like, if this is curiosity, not so specific related to EEOC, but do you see kind of other branches of government, maybe former people in those kind of like key leadership positions doing similar things? Or is this something that maybe can inspire, maybe, I don't know, the Department of Defense or, Social Security Administration, things like that? Are you seeing that in the worlds that you're in?
Yeah, I think that a number of the former politicals or other high-level career folks from different agencies have been doing this
Okay.
in a sort of informal manner.
Okay.
As my friends know, whenever I get a new idea, I buy a domain name. So
Yes.
I've owned many domain names over my life.
I understand.
With some of them, I have also created websites. So, this was a group of people that came together initially just for one purpose. Oh my God, EOC had just stepped away from these 7 cases of transgender folks. We came together just to see, can we help connect these folks with lawyers,
Mhm.
and get them lawyers. There wasn't the idea in that first meeting, oh, and let's set up a group.
Mhm.
But I, of course, once I saw it, I'm like, oh my God, here is a resource,
Yeah.
but we need to do the organization. And that's something I do, so buy the domain name, build the website, have, every other week meetings. So again, I think this is happening elsewhere. It just may not be as prominent.
Yeah, yeah. And it's such a, it's a reminder for everyone who's listening about the ways of staying informed, right? So if you have access to information, or if you have access to, a group of leaders who once had similar roles, right? Of sharing that with other people, of like how this actually works, right? The maybe for some of us, like understanding basic civics, other people may not understand how our government works, right? So sharing that, and then maybe contrasting with what's happening now, of like, that's not supposed to happen that way, right? Like that's a piece of it, speaking up, and then this kind of taking action, right? And like, hi, great example of like, I know how to build websites, and I'm a natural organizer, and I can bring people together, like just recognizing like no one person has to solve the everything that seems to be failing right now, but like we all have a lane that we're in. So just contribute, do something, please, right? And like, kind of to Karen, to your point, like just break that silence in the ways that we really need to. Um, so kind of curious too, Karen, like just kind of on this piece of, maybe some of these other ways of responding. Like I know that you've bravely challenged current leadership, and I was hoping, and specifically challenging leadership at the federal level in its attempts to kind of weaponize the EEOC, or maybe even taking some of the teeth away from the commission. So could you elaborate a little bit on some of like what has recently happened, some of that history that maybe not everyone is familiar with, and how and why you responded, and what has happened since, breaking that silence?
Well, I leaned, when I realized no one else was going to say anything, and that first executive order came down, and then we were told to hold back on moving forward with cases, LGBTQ plus cases, and in particular cases where the complainants were trans. I was so horrified. I just leaned into my natural weirdness. I just decided, all bets were off. I'm going to completely be authentic. And that's why I sent the email to Andrea Lucas and CC'd about everybody else in the agency. And I didn't intend for it to get leaked, but it got leaked. God bless the person who leaked it on Reddit. But, if you read the email, you can see I am very plain spoken, and I just said it in the language that I felt was authentic. I called her out, and I got blowback for it. And as of within about 2 days ago, like, from when this podcast was taped, I was fired. But I I just leaned into that, like, the, sorry, my authentic self came out, and that meant, speaking in plain language, strongly. And my second email too, I followed up when really they were continuing. They were double down, triple downing on the harm. In April, I sent another email telling Andrea Lucas that she should resign, and I embedded the music video for Everybody Wants to Rule the World by Tears for Fears. And I think people were like, she has got to be nuts. And I was like, no, when you're dealing with this level of, especially from attorneys who know better, this kind of hatred and violation of the law, they've broken the social contract. I don't feel the need to stand on ceremony or do things the way they think they should be done. And sometimes I personally communicate better, sometimes with music through song. And I thought this is perfect. And, it was spicy, but it made the point. It got attention. So I think my larger point is that you don't have to, you stay in your lane, right? But you define what that lane is and your comfort level. I knew coming out of the gate that I risked getting fired, and I made that risk assessment. I think that's another thing too. Before you take an action, take your own, temperature and see, what you're willing to risk. Not everyone can risk in the same way, and that's okay. But and you, like you said, choose a lane, but you decide what that lane looks like. It could be narrow, it could be windy, it could be you know, uh, uh, a carpool lane where you bring people with you, So you get to define and be creative. And I've been very creative. So I've spoken out internally. I started to get press attention. I'm pretty good with relating to journalists. So I've leaned into that skill set. And, I also went so far as to, I was actually at the hearing last week. I went on my own money and own time to DC to sit there in the gallery and listen to Andrea Lucas lie. and um, and afterwards, I went around to all the senators that had really asked her the tough and necessary questions and left thank you notes with their staff. I mean, I was thinking out of the box. So, um, and nothing, you don't have to do everything, and you don't have to do it right now, this second. You know, um, all my moves have been thought through
Mhm.
and intentional, and I think so far very effective.
Yeah,
Not in keeping my job, but in getting the message out, which is more important to me than any job.
absolutely. And I think you'll definitely have the opportunity to continue speaking the truth in terms of what you're seeing. I love how you describe the lanes. I think your lane has really good music in terms of the
Yeah, I have the
it's,
good playlist.
yeah, I love that. I love that. Okay, so hi, you were talking about, the lane that you're in, kind of organizer, the law, you're starting organizations. You mentioned the EEO Leaders Organization. There's also another organization that I think that maybe there's some history with your fingerprints behind that, and that's Pride in Exile. So I was hoping that you could maybe share a little bit about what led to you starting that group, and what's its mission now? Like, has it evolved? And, what are you hoping to accomplish with this particular organization?
Yes, so about the same time that the top level EEOC officials, were getting pulled together, I had someone who had worked for me at the EEOC who knew someone within the EEOC who had been on the EEOC's Pride board, right? So almost every government agency, companies have LGBTQ affinity groups. They'd been in an affinity group, and at the EEOC, as well as at other federal agencies, those had been disbanded. So the person who had worked for me simply connected me with the person who was still at the EEOC. And I said, well, maybe just set something up outside and, literally just for EEOC employees, and let's call it Pride in Exile. And then the person in the OC came up with the Gmail address. So if anyone wants to write, it's prideinexile11@gmail.com. And that's because the Pride group was set up at EEOC in 2011.
Oh, okay. I was
So
wondering
it's
what.
Pride in Exile. But our goal then was to, like, it was very clear to me, and, again, I bought the domain name that night. Um, and, but the goal is if any other federal agency wanted to start a sort of Pride in Exile group, we wanted our website to be available to them. And the truth is, at this point, any company, for companies that are getting rid of their affinity groups, which we should come back to because it's not a good idea, but again, that there should be a Pride in Exile group. So that was the initial piece. But then it became very clear to us because of what Karen was calling out, that the EOC was not doing what it should do with federal sector claims, claims that federal employees were bringing. That we needed to tell people what they could still do and what their rights were. And so early on, we did a webinar for federal employees. Well, then it became clear what the EOC was doing, that is, not doing, with all of the charges, and not just transgender folks bringing gender identity claims, but transgender folks bringing disability claims. They were all getting stalled. They weren't getting dismissed right away because that would have been very obvious. Instead, they were taken, they were put in the system, and then the staff was told, don't do anything. So we then felt in Pride and Exile, we needed to put out information. And so if anyone, right after listening to this podcast, after you go to the eeoleaders.org site, you should go to the prideinexile.org site and you'll see recordings of an event that we're going to be holding soon before the podcast airs. But you can look at the recording about harassment issues for specifically LGBTQ plus individuals and making it clear what the law does still say in terms of protection. And then the last thing I will say, because I want to follow up in terms of what Karen did in terms of her courage. So anyone who does not know Karen Ortiz should just Google Karen Ortiz, EEOC. You'll see an AP story, you'll see New York Times story, and I will tell you, those of us sitting in the EEO leaders group meetings and the Pride in Exile meetings, when we heard what Karen had said, when we heard about the email she sent, I can't even tell you how grateful we felt that someone inside the EOC was speaking up. We understood the fear that other people had. It's not that we didn't understand it, but exactly, Karen, what you're saying is at some point there have to be people willing to speak up, but they have to be people who do their own risk assessment, just like you did, and who decide it's more important to blow that whistle even if it means that they won't be able to keep their job. If they're willing to do that, oh my goodness, we are so grateful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you
Courage
for
is.
that. Hi.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I didn't already own my own domain name, I would think you have it.
Oh my God, I probably bought about 30 domain names.
Well, Pride in Exile adopted me. So, and now I'm truly exiled. So,
You
it's
have a
very
home.
fitting. I do
Oh,
have a
you have a
home.
home.
I do have a home.
I mean, your courage, Karen, like you were just kind of describing kind of this bystander effect of everyone kind of looking around, waiting for someone else to speak out, and just like the example of being that upstander of like, all right, I'm the one. And the fact that I really like how you walked us through of like, just assess, right? Like, are you safe to do this? Like, what can be the potential consequences? And for you, you knew what the potential consequence could be. You could have lost your job, which is where you're at this place right now. However, I feel like after folks listen to this podcast, right? There's lots of organizations that probably need a really good lawyer or judge consultant to help them navigate these times. So if there's ways we can support you and just finding that next place to really help using that expertise that you have, we absolutely need it in the world that we're
I
in. And
appreciate that. But the
yeah,
reward, honestly,
yeah,
is just knowing I'm doing the right thing
yeah,
and that when I go to sleep at night, I'm not losing sleep over that decision. I might be
absolutely.
losing sleep on about other things, but and then the community that has embraced me
Yeah,
is is priceless, absolutely priceless.
absolutely.
Talk
Yes.
about belonging. Now I feel like I belong more now than ever.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
You always have a home here. So in terms of sharing what you know, and we would
I
love to bring you
appreciate
both
that.
back to the show just to help us kind of navigate where we are and where we continue to go. Um, I wanted to end the show and thank you all for sticking around. This is just such a really important conversation around right like what the show is about, which is imagining belonging and imagining a future where we have this belonging society that's big enough for all of us, right? That we all know that we're safe, we trust each other, or can have those conditions to start to feel what often for many of us can feel pretty elusive. And so I'm wondering from each of you, just kind of like for closing remarks, like this vision that you have for the future, and maybe some practical actions that those of us who are listening to this show, DEI leaders, people and culture leaders, organizational leaders, like maybe some of the things we can do in the lanes that we're kind of driving in. Any advice that you might have for that? So whoever would like to go first.
I'll hop in. I think one thing I had said this once, I think on another podcast years ago with Minda Harts. She asked me if I had, advice, I think for law students, and I said, come as your authentic self. Like, and then years later, I think about it, I go, what the hell does that mean? So I think doing the work to figure out who your authentic self is super important, and
Yeah,
that can be quiet work. But once you get really solid in that, I think for me, it's been easier to really show up as my authentic self and not be so bothered by, um, you know, norms. Even as a judge, I don't care if somebody's wearing a suit. I don't care if they're using, slang. I don't care if they mistakenly call me miss instead of judge. Just like get over yourself if
yeah,
you're in a position of authority, because if you don't get over yourself, you won't learn. You won't fully hear these stories that we want to tell each other.
yeah,
So I think that would be my message to leaders, like kind of get over yourself and and realize that there's real value in being humble and listening and interrogating your own biases and initial reactions to people. And it's so satisfying and freeing to be in that mindset for me personally. I mean, that's sort of lofty, but to me, that's sort of the root of how we're going to really get to this belonging stage. I mean, I was raised on Mr. Rogers and Free to Be You and Me, and I wonder like what happened to Generation X? Like, weren't we all raised that way? But we can do the work to get back there.
yeah, yeah. I think this is our chance for Gen Xers or Zennial or not Zennials. Yeah, Zennials. um, like it's our time, in some ways to put some of those lessons of Mr. Rogers and Free to Be into action, right? Like I think that we're finding this opportunity, and I love what you're saying about that deep inner work of knowing who we are, and also right, like who we need to become to be the leaders we've been waiting for, right? And so I think like just we can all do that. Like for folks listening to this show is just kind of jotting down like right now, like who do we need to be to kind of like address the mess that we're in and why does that matter? And I
And
really
it may take you on a path you didn't expect. I mean,
yeah,
because I'm being fired because of what I said and how I said it.
yeah,
And I wouldn't take anything back because I am being my authentic self. And I think that um, what I've gotten in exchange is worth way more than a job. So it can just have real earth moving effects on your life in such a profound way. I don't know what's next, but I know whatever's next is going to be incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. I see that for you. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And hi, we'll go to you.
Yeah, so I'm glad to be the baby boomer representative here, especially because a lot of the folks in very top leadership, right, are in that generation. And I think I would pick up on this in this way because I have been thinking, okay, so what's the way forward? And I think number one, we have to have a vision, right? We have to have a vision of where do we want to get to ultimately. And that's might be very aspirational, but articulating it for ourselves is very important. Second, we need strategic thinking and persistence because what you do is going to depend on strategically what makes sense. And sometimes it's something very incremental, sometimes it's something very bold, sometimes it's for one group to do it incremental and another group to do it bold. I mean, to really understand that strategic thinking includes both of this and to be persistent. You know, I used to have a thing up on my wall in the EEOC, Karen, I'm sure you'll appreciate this, that says the person who says it's impossible should get out of the way of the person doing it.
Amen.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's like
Yeah.
we're being persistent, we're moving forward. And then the third piece is back to what we said before. It's changing hearts and minds. It's really reaching out with our stories. So having people tell their stories, having them supported in telling their stories, having those stories amplified by people who did not have that personal experience, that's all part of the changing hearts and minds. And I'll end with this, which again I used to say a lot, and now I've been having to say a lot more recently. So I always described myself as an optimist. And to me, an optimist is not someone who's like Pollyannish, oh, everything's going to be fine. You know, no, an optimist is someone who takes the time to assess the lay of the land, figure out what's going on, and then believes that it's possible to take some steps forward. And those steps might be very small depending on the lay of the land, but just to believe that it's still possible. So, for example, everyone listening, if you're doing DEI or, you know, talent retention or culture or whatever it is in your companies, to not like retreat from DEI. Don't do that. Revisit, refresh your DEI. Make sure that your affinity groups are open to everybody, you know, and they're not exclusive. All you have to do is don't be exclusive and don't have like preferences. Those are the only two things that are not okay under the law. Everything else is. So that's part of the strategic thinking and the persistence, figuring out what you can still be doing, and then making sure that creates an inclusive, belonging space, because that's how people can tell their stories. And I will tell you right here on this podcast, I feel I have learned. I cannot tell you how happy I am to have actually now met Karen in person. She and I've emailed every now and then, but that's hearing someone's story.
Yes. Yes. This is, I'm going to leave it there. I just want to thank both of you. Hi, Karen, for taking so much time. I mean, this is just such this is a gem of an episode, and I'm excited to share it with our audience and anyone else who finds it, because you've both provided me with a lot of hope and a lot of direction. So thank you. And just thank you for your leadership. I appreciate you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.